Hi guys, and welcome back to AP Environmental Science. We're going to start Unit 3 coming up here on ecology and biodiversity. So here's a list of topics that we're going to be talking about in this unit. A lot of it should look very familiar from biology, and because of that you are expected to know a good amount of this already and will be moving pretty quickly. So in your textbook it's going to cover these chapters here. Mostly we will be working out of chapter 3 and 5. We'll just be finishing up some carbon cycle things from chapter 4 and talking about biomes with chapter 6. So let's jump right into ecological organization and start talking about ecosystems and what happens in them. So last unit we mentioned this vocabulary word called limiting factors. Limiting factors are any kind of resources or conditions that's going to limit the growth of something. So we've talked about these in a couple of different ways. There are biotic factors that can limit growth. So these would be any living things or things that used to be living that could impact organisms in the way they survive. So things like predators, they're going to limit a population. Some things might depend on fallen leaves as food source, so that would limit them. Competition, diseases, these are all things that could limit the reproduction or the growth of either an organism or population. There are also all those abiotic factors that we talked about last time, all those environmental factors that were never living but affect how organisms survive. So things like sunlight, water, natural disasters, rock formations, all those cycles that we just talked about would be abiotic factors. And these are going to impact how living things interact with their environment. So when we talk about the environment, we want to talk about it on a number of different levels. And we've already mentioned the biosphere level, the largest level, but we want to also address the environment at a biome level, an ecosystem level, a community level, population level, and an individual level. So if we start to look at these and what they're made up of, most of these larger categories include both biotic and abiotic factors. So things like the biosphere, the biome, the ecosystem, in these cases we're looking at how those living things are interacting with those abiotic factors. But once we start to get down to the level of the community on down, now we're looking pretty much at just the living things and how they are interacting with each other. It's important to remember too that we could go smaller than this if we wanted to, smaller than the individual. We could go down to a level of organ systems, then organs, tissues, cells, even organelles inside the cells, molecules, atoms, even subatomic particles. So just remember that's all part of the bigger picture, but we are going to generally focus on this individual to ecosystem level in this class. So if we go back and remember what the biosphere is, that's just everywhere where life exists in the world. So it includes pretty much all of the land, some of the air down in the troposphere, any of the water where you have living things, any of the atmosphere where you have living things. Then the level under that is biome. This is a group of ecosystems that all have the same climate and dominant living communities. And people have a little bit of trouble telling these apart from ecosystems sometimes, but biomes are like large categories that you can find all over the world. Ecosystems, on the other hand, is only in one particular place in the world. So an ecosystem is a collection of all the organisms plus the environment, all those abiotic factors that you can find in one large geographical area. So for example, if we look at Arctic tundra, we have Arctic tundra in many different places. So that would be the biome overall, this Arctic tundra biome, but then you may look at the Alaskan tundra as a particular ecosystem in that biome. Next, under ecosystem, we have communities, and communities are basically several populations of different species all living in one defined area. We should remember what a species is, and remember that biologists define a species by being something that can reproduce and produce fertile offspring when they do that. So if you have two dogs that can reproduce and have fertile offspring, you have a species. So community, several different species living in one particular area. So for example, all the species that live on a coral reef. A population, on the other hand, is a group of individuals of the same species living in one specific area. So, for example, all the blue crabs in the Chesapeake Bay is a population. All of the buffalo in Yellowstone National Park, another population. Just one species, just one place. And then we can get down to the level of an individual where we're talking about one particular organism of that species. Now, when we talk about biomes, which is what we're going to start to go into more detail about, we're talking about huge regions of land all over the world. But what makes them similar is they have similar climates, soil, and communities of organisms. And they contain all these different ecosystems that all have these similar characteristics in different locations. And it's because all of their abiotic characteristics are similar, and therefore all of their biotic, all their living communities kind of adapt similarly to those conditions. So here are your major terrestrial biomes, and we'll start to look at these more in class. But the differences here are usually coming from differences in climate, and that's why we talked about abiotic factors first, because it's all those things that we talked about last unit that are going to impact where you find these different biomes. So an important thing to keep in mind here too is that when we do different things to the environment, like remove a lot of the natural vegetation to farm or graze livestock, or we cut down forests for lumber, or we mine areas, that can change all of these biomes too. So this is something that is not set in stone. This is the way these areas have typically behaved, but they can change. So all of these biomes depend on two major things. Since they're dependent on climate, they depend on temperature and precipitation, because remember, those are the factors that limit climate. And when we're talking about climate, it's not weather, it's not day to day. We're talking about what generally happens over a long period of time, like 30 or more years. And you can see that when you have a very hot and wet area, you would be more likely to get these types of biomes. As you go drier or as you go colder, the biomes start to change. And that means that all your typical vegetation and plants and animals will change as a result. One of the things you're going to notice is that with biomes, you have two kind of different patterns going on. You have a pattern in altitude and a pattern in latitude. So, and they kind of look similar to each other. So if you look at the map of the biomes, you can kind of see that like deserts tend to be in the same general area latitude-wise, and forests tend to be in the same general area as far as latitude goes. So that happens because of all those things we've already talked about, like the prevailing winds at those latitudes, the amount of solar radiation that's happening there, that sort of stuff. Now, we also get a similar change when we move from the bottom of a mountain to the top. It looks very similar to when we start at the equator and moved towards the poles. This is called a vertical zonation. It goes up in altitude, and the biomes change as you go up the mountain. So hiking up a mountain can be really similar to traveling from the equator up to the North Pole. And that basically happens because as you go up in altitude in the troposphere, the temperature goes down. And since it goes down, cold water can hold less moisture. And as the temperature goes down and the moisture goes down, there's going to be less precipitation in general. So that's going to cause this similar change here. In both cases, as the temperature goes down, there's less precipitation, and that changes the amount of flora and fauna, those plants and animals that you see. Right, so here's just another example of that. But for example, at the base of a mountain, if you're in Colorado, you might find a deciduous forest. It might be different if your mountain is in a tropical area, because then you'll start off with a tropical rainforest instead. At the higher elevations, you're going to start to see a coniferous forest, conifers, evergreens. This would be like the northern boreal forests that are up in Canada and Alaska. If you go even higher, you will get to what we call alpine tundra, which in the mountains we have grasses, sedges, small tufted plants. Again, that would be much like the tundra in parts of Canada and Alaska. And eventually you get up to the point where there's just bare rock, ice, and snow, maybe some lichens, but that's about the only living thing. So this looks very similar to what happens as you go towards the poles. Now, there are some differences between this latitude and altitude pattern. Alpine tundra, which would be mountain tundra, would receive more precipitation than the Arctic tundra, which would be the latitude one, especially when you're on the windward side of the mountain where that wind is coming along. Remember, our rain shadow effect makes the clouds drop all of their precipitation on that windward side. So that side of the mountain may get much more precipitation than tundra would normally get. Also, high elevations aren't going to experience those huge extremes in day length that we get as far as latitude goes when we change seasons. Remember that the North Pole and the South Pole are going to have certain seasons where they have very long days and certain seasons where they have very short days. You don't get those extremes at high elevations because you didn't change the amount of solar radiation that was coming in. You're still in the same spot on the Earth. Also, the solar radiation is going to be more intense at high altitudes. You are higher up in the atmosphere, so less of that UV radiation has been processed, basically. That ozone layer hasn't had a chance to absorb it all because you're higher up. So since it's passing through less atmosphere, less of it's going to be absorbed. You're going to have more intense effects, and the plants and animals that live there have to be able to deal with that and be adapted for that. Now, one of the things that we're looking at with climate change is that these alpine areas, which follow that similar pattern, are actually even more in danger of changes. As we start to see climate change, this pattern starts to recede up the mountain a little bit, and we get more and more of these bottom biomes and less of the top ones. So everything starts to migrate upwards, all the plants, all the animals, the entire biome. But that's limited by how tall the mountain is. If they can only go up so far, then you're going to start to see extinction rates among those alpine species as those biomes change their distribution on the mountain. And that's another thing that's sort of up in the air with what's going to happen. All right, so we've mentioned some of our terrestrial biomes, and we've shown you a map of those real quick. We're going to start to go into more detail in these, and you're going to have a major project that is due on these. So most of our focus in class will be on the terrestrial, the land biomes. But you also need to know about the aquatic life zones, and that would be anything in the water. These guys have different limiting factors because they are in the water. And since they're in the water, precipitation isn't going to limit them since they're surrounded by it. Temperature is also not as important because of water's high specific heat, which allows it to keep the temperature pretty constant. But you do get temperature zones developing as a result of density and salinity. And remember, salinity is the concentration of dissolved salts. You should also write down these other limiting factors that can change aquatic life zones and impact the organisms that live there. These are the things that are going to determine which organisms you see in aquatic biomes instead of the temperature and precipitation determining them like they do in the terrestrial ones. So these are the types of aquatic ecosystems you're going to start to look at, and you will notice that they all have their own distinct animal species as well as other species. But their distribution is a little bit different. It's not based so much on sunlight, it's based more on the location of the continents, the way the plates move, topography, and altitude. There are some latitude differences also because you get different temperatures at different latitudes. So next class you're going to be taking notes on these aquatic ecosystems, and then when I come back the class after that we will start to get into that biome project and what it's going to entail and how do we put all this together to describe our ecosystems. All right, so come in, make sure you get your notes next time, and then stay tuned.